Hi, Cara. Welcome to the course.
Hi, Madison. Thank you for having me. Yeah,
Of
so
course.
great to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited you agreed to do this. So, Cara is coming on today to talk a little bit about her story with intuitive eating and food sensitivities. So, if you want to start us off, Cara, with telling us a little bit about your story and kind of what led you to doing the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do the Cliff Notes version. Like many women, right around like my puberty years, like middle school, high school, I started to become increasingly aware of my body and the fact that like people were looking at it and judging it and that it became important. And I started dieting. I had a mom that dieted. I read a ton of magazines. I was like really into like America's Next Top Model and Teen Vogue and Us Weekly and all of the things. So I was really inundated and influenced by the media, as well as the fact that like talking about hating your cellulite was like a very common thing in my family, like with the women in my family, with my mom, bless her heart. So I started to restrict very casually just by reducing carbs, and that restriction really snowballed into an eating disorder. And eventually I was binging and eventually purging, and I had this really disordered relationship with food for 10 years. And throughout that process of just mentally and emotionally feeling not great about myself and like turning to food to like not have to deal with the realities of life. I also physically just didn't feel great. Like I just felt physically unwell, like tired all the time, cold all the time, thinking about food all the time, thinking about how much I hated my body all of the time, having headaches and bloated all of the time. So it was just such a different reality from where I'm at now, thankfully. And it really took over my life. Like it was like my life was like thinking about food and feeling crappy about my body. And after deciding that I wanted to get better and like really working towards recovery and really practicing all of the things that I needed to practice so that I could be at peace with food and actually also be at peace with who I was. Because a huge part of this was that my identity was in my body and I didn't know who I was outside of my body.
Yeah.
Um,
So many women experience that same thing. It's like we are our bodies, but really we're not. We're very much separate from them. But yeah, okay, keep going.
mm-hmm. Yeah, massively. We're taught that though.
Yeah.
I feel like that's programmed into us. And so I spent 3 years like deprogramming myself, so to speak. And I spent 3 years like really working on adequately feeding myself and not restricting myself and being okay with food. And I had an entirely different career for a while. And then I just, magically out of nowhere, the idea of health coaching was brought into my life. And that just felt really good. Like I was like, yeah, actually, I would really love to help women not deal with this because it's painful and it's hard. And women are so much greater contribution to this planet than like being things that are nice to look at. Because women, we're beautiful, we're nice to look at, and that's really not why we're here. Like that's not the purpose. And I want to free women up from those constraints so they can live lives that they love.
100%.
You know?
It's so crazy. It's not just at the individual level. Like when you think about like healing yourself and freeing up yourself and what you have the capability and potential to do, like that's awesome. But when you think about it collectively as women, if we could all free ourselves from that, like imagine what we could do, imagine what the world would be like. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, massively. I mean, like millions of women are feeling shamed around their body, and shame is bottom of the barrel when it comes to emotions, on the spectrum. And yeah, it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
And really knowing the pain, and really also then knowing the freedom from it, knowing like the other side. And I like can't think of many examples in life where the grass really is greener, but this is one of those examples. The grass really is freaking greener over here. Like it is vibrant, it is thriving, it's like alive, and and I want to help women get here. And so, I just was like, that's what I'm dedicating my life to. I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur and had an entrepreneurial spirit and have a soul that's like hungry to be of service and to be a contribution. And it's the most incredible work I've ever done. And I feel really lucky to be able to do it. And, so it was from my own struggles that I ended up here. I don't think that I could do this work and not have gone through it myself.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, thank you for sharing your story. That is such an incredible story, and I feel like can give so many of my students a lot of hope, and the grass is definitely greener. I can attest to that too. But let's go ahead and dive into the topic that we're talking about today, and that is intuitive eating with a food allergy or food intolerance or sensitivity. So do you think it's possible for someone to be able to eat intuitively if they have an food allergy, sensitivity, intolerance, whatever you want to call it?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. I'm an example of that. I know other women who are examples of that. And I don't think that if you have a genuine food sensitivity, you can absolutely be an intuitive eater. I also think that sometimes what we think we're intolerant to can actually be a reflection of the mental stress that we have around it and like the bloating. That's obviously a different topic, but yes, you can absolutely be an intuitive eater and have food sensitivities for sure.
Cool. Well, thank you. So then at what point in the process of making peace with food in your body is it appropriate to start considering if you think you might have a food sensitivity, and how do you know if it's, an actual sensitivity or if it's, like you said, your mind just getting caught up back in the diet culture and that mindset?
Yeah. That's tricky, right? Like obviously there's tests that can show you if you're really actually allergic. And then obviously you can just tune in and be like, wow, every time I eat this, I don't feel that great. Right. But I think in terms of like at what point of the process do you start to pay attention to your food sensitivities? That's really going to be different for everybody. And it's not I think that based on my experience, I don't know if there's like the right time necessarily. It's more about the relationship that you have with yourself and the relationship you have to that food and how you feel about yourself for eating that food. So in some ways, if you're allergic to dairy, right, you're lactose intolerant, and you know that what makes you feel best and honors your body the best is to not have dairy, that can show up like a food rule, right? Like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat dairy. I must avoid dairy. Right. And if we're operating from the diet mentality or from the mentality of having an eating disorder, what's typically going to happen is we're going to tell ourselves how we really shouldn't eat it. We need to avoid it. We'll say things like, I can't eat it. And then if we eat it, how do you react to that decision to eat it? Your reaction is truly the difference between someone who can have an intuitive, healthy relationship with food and have a food sensitivity and someone who's likely binging or purging or has, on the restrictive spectrum.
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense because it's easy to see how if you are still caught up in the diet mentality and you're like, I can't eat dairy, then you eat the dairy and you feel like shame and guilt and all those things, then it's clearly like kind of signals back to like needing to do some more of that work on breaking free from the diet mentality and really making peace with food. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, because ultimately the difference between someone who can, like, for the most part, honor their sensitivities and someone who really struggles to, because like I have had so many women that I've worked with over the years who will tell me like, I can't eat dairy and I can't eat gluten. And yet I'm like binging on cookies and ice cream. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you can't do it?
Yeah.
You're doing it. You are putting those foods in your mouth. So that conversation of like, I can't eat it, that's the diet mentality. The diet mentality tells us we can't. And so we have to really powerfully get to this place of like, I can eat these things. I really can. Got that there might be some implications for eating them, but you can put those foods in your mouth. And so the question is, do you want to eat them? And then if you decide like, yeah, you know what, I really got that if I eat these cookies and ice creams that I'm going to have a stomach ache, I might feel, brain fog and lethargic, but I actually really want them. And if you can do that and be okay with it and kind of put a metaphorical period after that experience and just be like, okay, I ate that. Might feel a little sick later, and then moving on with your life. That's a normal relationship with food and having food sensitivities. So it's basically the amount of shame that you feel after, quote, breaking the food rule. That is the distinction between someone who can have a normal intuitive relationship with food and someone who really struggles.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way to look at it. And it's such an easy way for people to tell too. Like it's, if you're having that shame or not. So it's very easy to tap into that and figure out what's really going on. So that's really cool. So I know you have a dairy sensitivity. So how did you kind of stumble upon figuring that out, and how do you navigate that in your life now?
So I like when I was struggling with my eating disorder, I had thought that like cheese was like a good food because it was low in carbs. Cause I'm like from the Atkins era, like in the late 90s, somewhere around that time. And so I really thought that like anything that was low in carbs was good. So I like went to town on cheese, and I randomly, not intentionally, like stumbled across a bunch of like vegan based literature. And I had never before in my life heard someone like say that carbs are okay to eat. But a lot of the vegan based literature, like the China studies, stuff like this, will talk about how like you can eat these things. And it blew my mind because I had never been told that like it was okay to eat these things. And then obviously they argued against eating dairy. And I had also never heard that before in my entire life. Like that was like, I know that might seem really bizarre, but this was like pre-Instagram days. And like, I don't think we had access to the internet, but it wasn't like, I'm aging myself here, but it wasn't like that. I wasn't like Googling things yet. I don't think Google was a thing yet. Yeah. So like I had only heard whatever I had read in magazines and from my mom. And so hearing like, oh, you could possibly be lactose intolerant, or like dairy could cause these things. Like that was like, mind blown. Never heard that before. So I just experimented. And I played around, and I stopped eating cheese, and like I started to feel a difference in my experience in my body. So it was just like I just stopped eating it, and it wasn't coming from this place of I can't eat it. I was just like, oh, maybe my joints hurt really bad and I'm bloated and my skin is all crazy because dairy's not good. Like maybe it doesn't work for me. So I didn't come at it from the diet mentality. I didn't come at it like, oh, I can't eat this. I was like, I actually want to try not eating this, and I'm just going to try it out. It wasn't shame, fear, guilt. I can't. It was just, I'm going to try this to see what happens. And I like stopped eating it, and I started to feel better. And I was like, wow. Okay. I think I'm just going to keep not eating this because I don't feel really great when I do. And it was an empowered choice. It wasn't, I can't eat this. It was like, I can. And when I do, I don't feel that great. And I actually want to feel great. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to just find some dairy alternatives. And it was like, it wasn't this huge ordeal. It was just, I realized I felt better when I didn't eat it.
Right. So do you ever eat it now as in any time?
Not often. But every once in a while, like I'll have a bite of my boyfriend's pizza if he, is watching football or whatever, mm-hmm. or if I'm at a girlfriend's house and it's like wine and cheese, but it's not something that I consume regularly. And it's not something like I buy for myself. And not because I'm demonizing that food. And I'm not stressed out about it. Like if I end up having a bite and I have a stomach ache, or if I'm like gassy later, I'm just like, sorry, bro, like to my boyfriend or whatever. Like it's not, I don't shame myself. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like I don't make myself wrong for quote breaking my dairy food rule, right? Like I'm like, a bite of that looks really good. I'm just going to have a bite, or like maybe I'll have a whole slice, which doesn't happen often, but I just don't beat myself up. And that's the distinction, truly, is not having guilt and shame and having this internal monologue of like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I shouldn't have done that. Well, since I've already eaten it, I might as well just eat the whole thing. Like that's that mindset that really triggers the binging. I don't know who the target audience is of this particular course, like if it's for binge eaters or what it's for. I'm asking you.
Yeah. Oh, it's people who have like experienced binging and restriction. So both.
Okay. So that monologue, right? Like that monologue that we have of like, oh, I shouldn't have eaten this. Well, since I've already done it, I should just go to town.
Mm-hmm.
That monologue is very classic binge restrict cycle, diet binge cycle type of diet mentality. And I don't have that internal monologue anymore. Like if I eat something, I'm like, okay, well, I might have a stomach ache. Okay, moving on.
Yeah, and it's not the end of the world, and you can, it's almost like you can sit with that feeling, you're aware of the feeling, but you don't let it consume you, and you know it's going to pass, like tomorrow or in an hour or whenever it is, I'll feel better, so it's fine, moving on, focusing on better things. So I
Mm-hmm.
love that mindset. That's super helpful. But I was actually allergic to dairy when I was younger, like an actual food allergy. And then over time, the doctors told my parents that I had grown out of it, which I don't know what that means, but I grew out of my allergies. So had been like allergic to all dairy, strawberries, like all kinds of just random foods. And then I so-called grew out of it. So I ate dairy my whole life. And through this intuitive eating process, it's allowed me to like get back in touch with my body and realize that dairy doesn't always like sit super well with me. So I can kind of totally relate to you on that. And it's like pizza is my favorite food. So when I want pizza, I'm going to eat it, and I'm going to accept that maybe I don't feel great, but that's okay, because when I ate the pizza, I felt great, and that's what like mattered to me. So
Yeah.
I think that's super helpful for everyone who is, wondering if they have a food sensitivity and how to navigate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's worth kind of bringing up that like the feeling and look of being bloated can be very triggering for women who are struggling with it, with issues with food, because I based on my experience, 99% of the women that I have worked with who struggle with their relationship with food, it roots back to body image and feeling insecure with their body and body dissatisfaction. And so the look and feel of being bloated can be really triggering for these bad body image days. And so I think it's something that you want to bring awareness to, right? Like I used to really get triggered by looking bloated or like feeling bloated, like if my pants are tight, it would really mess with my head.
Yeah.
Whereas now, like I'll just put on some sweatpants and call it a day. Whereas before, it used to really send me into a little bit of a spiral. And so just for anyone who's in the middle of that right now, to have a lot of compassion on yourself and to know that like if you do end up feeling bloated, that it's okay. And creating more guilt and stress around the bloat perpetuates it and makes it worse, as opposed to just being like, okay, I got the stomach ache right now, like all good. This too shall pass. And yeah, back to what you said, like, you eat the pizza and you enjoy it while you're eating it, and you let it be a complete experience, like you put a period after it and you're like, okay.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said about how the stress around it can perpetuate the feelings of like being bloated or having the stomach ache, because I 100% relate to that. Like I've had a lot of like stomach issues in my life, and I'm like realized in the last couple of years that it's almost always ties back to stress. And for so long, I was like, I have to eliminate gluten and dairy and all the things because I have to figure out what I'm intolerant to and get to the root of this so that I can, figure out what works for my body. And yeah, that's just like resonates so much with me.
Yeah, of course. There's a couple of registered dietitians. Marcy Evans is the one that's immediately coming to mind. She gave this presentation on the correlation between eating disorders and what are known as functional gut disorders. And functional gut disorders are disorders that don't actually, like, we can't physically find something wrong with you, but you're experiencing the pain, and we acknowledge that you're in a lot of pain. And IBS falls under functional gut disorders because we're not 100% sure. Like it's kind of elusive, and it's like a big umbrella for a lot of different things that are happening. And what she had found in her research was that like 70% of women who have eating disorders like also had functional gut disorders. And that's also probably including people that aren't a part of that statistic, like myself. Like I was never clinically diagnosed. I've never filled out a survey. So it's like I had so many issues with my gut. Like I was bloated all the time, always. And I fit into that. I'm like, yeah, I had so much you know, like my stomach just like always was in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that so much of that was my mental relationship with food. And I've read some studies about how 40 to 60% of digestion takes place actually in the brain, like it's facilitated in the brain. And if you're stressed and anxious, you're taking away from your body's ability to digest, not only because a lot of it takes place there, but also because you're activating your sympathetic nervous system, which is that flight or fight response.
Mm-hmm.
And so your body is like taking blood away from the digestive tract and like sending it to your muscles because it thinks you're running from a tiger, which contributes to bloat. So if like you're afraid that what you're eating is bad for you, or that it's going to make you sick, or that it's going to make you fat, or that you really shouldn't be eating it because like sugar is the devil, like all of that stress, like your body can't categorize it into, oh, we're worried about eating healthy. No, your body, like stress is stress. You're running from a tiger and so what I have found in my experience working with women, and not only in myself, and it sounds like for you as well, that when we make peace with food, a lot of those gut issues dissolve. A lot of them fall away.
Mm-hmm. I
you know
100% experienced that. I had for several years just terrible gut issues. I was going to all the doctors and naturopaths and trying all these elimination diets and like, oh, I must have to eat the more perfect diet to get rid of these gut issues. Like if I just eliminate one more thing or do this more perfectly, then my gut issues will go away. And they only amplified, of course. Now I know, like, no shit, that makes sense. And it wasn't until I really made peace with food that I rarely have issues where my like digestive issues flare up. And if they do, I can always pinpoint it back to a stress. And then now I have tools to have self-compassion when I'm feeling stressed out, or go for a walk, call a friend, do things that de-stress me rather than turn to food to cope with those emotions that then perpetuates the bloating and the feeling bad in your body. So yeah, that's such an interesting conversation. And I've heard about that research with Marcy. I am definitely excited to read more about that.
Yeah. So to tie it all together, or like to bring it sort of back to the main focus of like, can you be an intuitive eater with food sensitivities? The answer is yes, absolutely. And it's also possible that some of the things that are that you think might be causing the digestive issues could be actually in correlation with the stress and the fear that we have around those foods. Because like the fear around gluten is intense. The fear around sugar is intense. The fear around dairy is intense, and that isn't to say that you can't actually have a genuine allergy. You absolutely can. And I really think that our ability to be an intuitive eater with food sensitivities comes from a place of self-care, and comes from making an empowered choice of like, I want to really feel great today, so I'm going to make an empowered choice not to eat this, as opposed to like, I really shouldn't eat that. I can't eat that. I'm bad if I eat that. Two totally different frame of minds,
Yeah, I agree. Totally all about the mindset. So, okay. So last thing, was there anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about today?
I mean, just to reiterate, I think that the distinction between someone who can have an intuitive relationship with food sensitivities and someone who really struggles is that sense of shame that they feel around breaking the rule. So that's, I think, just something to reiterate that and to bring it back to focus, or to rephrase that again. I really think that that's the distinction to pay attention to. And then to just have a lot of compassion on yourself. And it takes time and practice. And to remind yourself that you can eat whatever you want. You really can. Do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. I love that. That's such a great note to end on. Well, thank you so much, Cara, for doing this. I know my students are going to get so much value out of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your course.
Yeah, you are so welcome.